The Kremlin's travel advice this morning, warning Russians against trips to the United States and other allied nations, reveals not only deep paranoia of the regime, but also the precarious state of Russian politics. Maria Zakharova's claim that Russians risk being hunted down underscores Moscow's rhetorical shift towards portraying itself as the victim, as a besieged fortress. And this narrative reflects Russia's deteriorating international standing, its economic struggles, the collapse of the ruble, and the ongoing fallout from its war in Ukraine. Zakharova's call to avoid the US, Canada, and most EU countries over the Christmas season comes against the backdrop of the lowest point in US-Russian relations since the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Kremlin cites risks of politically motivated detentions, yet this claim is strategic exaggeration. It feels like Russia is literally inverting reality. The Kremlin risks looking absurd. It feeds a domestic narrative that the West is hostile to ordinary Russians, deflecting from the regime's own failures. And I find it so extraordinary that in the comments section there's so many comments telling me that I am Russophobic, that I hate Russia. Why do you hate Russia so? I don't at all. I don't at all. I spent 10 years in Russia. I have very many good Russian friends, and I have great fondness for Russia, for Moscow. I simply think that the current occupant of the Kremlin, or the current occupants of the Kremlin, are maddened and crazed by their desire to pursue this Ukrainian fantasy of the Novorussia, this empire, in an age where imperialism has vanished. The diplomatic relations have been strained by tit-for-tat detentions, missile strikes using Western technology, a war in Ukraine that Moscow portrays as a Western conspiracy. These factors serve to justify heightened rhetoric. Russia claims that foreign threats exist, and therefore travel should be discouraged, particularly by Russia's elite, who might otherwise defect or criticize the regime under exposure to the West. That is, if those Russian elite can actually enter Western countries, which many of them cannot. The Kremlin's warnings are also rooted in economic desperation. Western sanctions have eroded Russia's financial stability. The ruble is collapsing, inflation is soaring, almost impossible to buy butter. But butter is literally locked down, and even China, Russia's supposed ally, is curbing economic support. By discouraging travel, the Kremlin not only limits capital flight, but also keeps wealthier citizens under tighter control. Meanwhile, Zakharova's omission of specific EU countries from the ban list adds intrigue. This could reflect attempts to maintain economic ties with sympathetic European nations like Hungary or Austria, where Kremlin influence still oddly lingers. And such selective diplomacy underscores Moscow's vulnerability and desperation for allies. But Europe, Britain, the US would be eager to patch things up if the Kremlin were to withdraw from Ukraine. That's all it takes. That's all it takes. Because I don't think Putin is an issue. You've heard me say it many times. Complicating matters is Donald Trump's call for an immediate ceasefire, emphasizing his relationship with the Kremlin as a means of resolution. And Moscow's response, dismissing any concessions, highlights its unwillingness to compromise on demands such as Ukraine's NATO exclusion and territorial cessations. The obstinacy is as much about saving face as it is about global politics. To admit defeat would undermine the Kremlin's carefully curated image of strength and inevitability, unless, of course, they blame it on Putin. Putin is the linchpin here, isn't he? And I find it extraordinary that in this moment of major crisis, Putin hasn't gone on television, even at the end of a long table, to reassure his domestic audience about President Assad. And nothing is happening in the Syrian embassy. I'll put a picture of the Assyrian embassy at as a thumbnail so that you can find what it looks like in Moscow. Internally, these warnings serve another purpose of distraction. Russia's military struggles, economic isolation, public dissatisfaction are mitigated by stoking external fears. The Kremlin's propaganda machine paints Russia as encircled by enemies, a strategy perfectly devised during the Soviet era. It's like the fantasy of Elysia all over again. You put a garrison siege around one city, and then other people attack you. So you put another siege encampment around yourself, and then in the case of Julius Caesar, you attack from outside. And brilliant, but I don't think Putin is up to those games. But he is up to the distraction, or at least somebody who's claiming to be Putin is up to the distraction. The consequences of this erratic behavior extend beyond Russia. For the West, it's a warning sign of increased unpredictability in a nuclear-armed state. For Russia's allies, such as China, it signals the risk of overdependence on a faltering partner. Beijing's hesitancy to deepen its economic ties with Moscow reflects a calculated distance as China balances its own economic challenges and political aspirations, global aspirations. The Kremlin's travel warning is less about the genuine threats to Russian citizens abroad and more about consolidating control at home and sustaining the illusion of strength. It's a move born of desperation, reflecting the immense pressures of war, sanctions, diplomatic isolation. And as Russia teeters on the brink of economic and political collapse, its erratic behavior will likely become more pronounced, creating ripple effects that the world cannot ignore, and that are certainly not something to gloat over. This is something to worry about. Huge numbers of people trapped in Russia are at the mercy of this tyrannous regime.